There are times when London itself seems to whisper, a city so steeped in history that its very stones carry the weight of secrets untold. In the autumn of that particular year, a peculiar unease settled over its streets, a growing tension that manifested in the unspoken fears of its people. The newspapers, while careful in their phrasing, hinted at disturbances among men of influence, sudden resignations, inexplicable disappearances, whispers of unseen forces at work. Holmes, of course, was intrigued. He had, for several weeks, taken to scanning the lesser-known columns of the daily press with an unusual diligence. "Note the pattern, Watson," he remarked one morning, holding up a marked copy of the Times. A minor official in the Foreign Office resigns abruptly. A banker found drowned in the Thames. A judge, previously in excellent health, withdraws from the bench citing illness. All seemingly unconnected, and yet... He tapped the paper with a long, slender finger. A single thread runs through them all, though it is yet invisible to the common eye. There is something at work here, something that does not wish to be seen. I studied him with curiosity. It was rare for Holmes to be unsettled, yet there was a certain restlessness about him, a keen awareness that something lurked beneath the surface. It was a foreboding I too began to share, though at the time I did not realize just how deep the mystery would run, nor the darkness that awaited us. It was on such an afternoon, as Holmes sat absorbed in thought by the window, that the bell at 221B Baker Street rang sharply, announcing the arrival of a visitor who would change everything. Our visitor entered in such haste that I barely had time to close the door behind him before he crossed the threshold, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He was a man in his early 50s, well-dressed but dishevelled, his cravat loose, his eyes darting about the room as though he expected to find an unseen pursuer lurking in the corners. "Mr. Holmes, I am in terrible danger," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have no one else to turn to." Holmes, who had been studying the man with quiet intensity from the moment he entered, gestured for him to sit. "You are Sir Reginald Ashford," he stated matter-of-factly. "A member of Parliament, recently returned from the continent, though you have taken great pains to conceal it." Ashford started. How could you know?" Holmes waved a hand dismissively. "Your coat bears the dust of foreign railway compartments. Your boots have the peculiar polish of Parisian craftsmanship, and the scent of Turkish tobacco lingers on your cuffs, a brand not found in London. But let us dispense with trivialities. You spoke of danger. Explain." Ashford swallowed, his fingers tightening over the brim of his hat. "Mr. Holmes, I have stumbled upon something beyond politics, beyond even reason. A clandestine society that does not merely influence Parliament but controls it. They have their hands in the judiciary, the police, the banks, everywhere. And now that I know, I fear my life is forfeit." Holmes steepled his fingers. "And what proof do you have?" Ashford hesitated. "I have documents, names, records, but I dare not keep them on my person. I came here because I believe, I know they are watching me." I glanced at Holmes. His face betrayed no emotion, but I knew his mind was already whirring through 1,000 possibilities. "Very well, Sir Reginald," Holmes said at last. "Let us see if we can illuminate this shadow that looms over London." Sir Reginald leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They know I am here, Mr. Holmes." His fingers trembled as he wiped his brow, his manner that of a man who had long since reached the limits of endurance. Holmes studied him with an expression of quiet intensity. "And who are they, Sir Reginald?" The statesman hesitated, his lips parting as if to speak. But at that precise moment, a faint rustling interrupted him. A small envelope had been slipped under the door. It lay upon the Persian rug, an innocent enough thing save for the dark sense of finality it seemed to carry. Holmes retrieved it and examined it with his usual detachment. Unmarked, delivered by an expert hand. He turned it over with the tip of his index finger. the faintest trace of sandalwood, uncommon among London's messengers. He slit it open. Inside was a single playing card, a jack of spades. The card itself was ordinary, save for the Latin inscription scrawled across its surface. Silentium mortis. Silence is death, I murmured. Ashford turned ashen, gripping the arms of his chair. They have given their warning, his voice barely carried across the room. And I am already a dead man. Holmes twirled the card between his fingers, his eyes alight with interest. You will do nothing rash, Sir Reginald. Leave the documents where they are for now. We shall speak further tomorrow. Ashford hesitated, then nodded stiffly. Rising, he buttoned his coat with nervous hands and departed, his shadowed figure disappearing into the London night. Holmes gazed after him, the playing card still in his grasp. An unusual courtesy, he mused, to send a warning before the blade falls. The following morning, I was in the midst of preparing my notes, when a sudden knock startled me from my work. Before I could rise, Mrs. Hudson entered, her usually composed face bearing an unmistakable trace of anxiety. "A man is here to see you, Doctor," she said hesitantly. It's about Sir Reginald Ashford." I exchanged a quick glance with Holmes, who was already on his feet. We entered the sitting room to find a young constable, hat in hand, shifting his weight uneasily. "I regret to inform you, gentlemen," he began, his voice stiff with formality, "that Sir Reginald Ashford was found dead early this morning in an alley near Westminster." A silence settled over the room. Holmes moved first. "The cause?" "Robbery, sir, or so it seems." The constable cleared his throat. Body was found with his pockets turned out. No watch, no wallet, but... He hesitated. There was something in his hand. Holmes's fingers tightened against his forearm. "Yes?" The constable produced a small, wrapped bundle and placed it on the table. Carefully, Holmes unfolded the cloth to reveal a single playing card, the Jack of Spades. With measured deliberation, Holmes turned it over. The same Latin inscription stared back at us. Silentium mortis. The constable, unaware of its significance, continued. "Poor fellow's throat was marked, like he'd been strangled, but there's no sign of bruising. And the oddest thing, sir, the doctor at the scene said he could swear he smelled opium on the body." I turned to Holmes, expecting a response, but his face had become unreadable. He placed the card back upon the table and clasped his hands behind his back. "Watson," he said at last, his voice low, "we must act at once." Holmes stood at the window, his silhouette framed against the pale, shifting fog that curled through Baker Street. His hands were clasped behind his back, his lean figure utterly still save for the faint rise and fall of his breath. I watched him in silence. I had seen this posture before, this deep, calculating stillness that meant his mind was working faster than any man's in London. At length, he spoke. "Watson," he said, "we stand at the precipice of a mystery woven into the very fabric of this city. The death of Sir Reginald Ashford is no ordinary crime. It is but one movement in a far more elaborate composition." I hesitated. "You suspect murder, then?" Holmes turned, his grey eyes keen. "I suspect something far worse." He lifted the playing card once more, studying it in the dim light. "This is not a crime of impulse, nor one of mere vengeance. This is a warning, carefully issued and deliberately carried out." He turned the card between his fingers. "And whoever sent it shall expect their warning to be heeded." His gaze darkened. "They shall soon discover their error." The morning was grey with mist when Holmes and I arrived at the alley in Westminster, where Sir Reginald Ashford had met his untimely end. A small crowd had gathered, though the presence of uniformed constables kept them at bay. Inspector Lestrade was already at the scene, his expression one of weary resignation. "A nasty business," he remarked as we approached. "Looks like a common footpad's work. Pockets turned out, Valuables missing. We'll do what we can, of course, but I doubt we'll get far. Westminster's alleys have swallowed up finer men than him." Holmes said nothing at first. He crouched beside the body, his sharp eyes flitting over the details with methodical precision. He did not look at the torn clothing or the mud-streaked hands, nor did he concern himself with the lack of a weapon. Instead, he inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring slightly. "Interesting," he murmured. "Do you detect it, Watson?" I bent closer, noting nothing beyond the usual odours of damp brick and refuse. "I cannot say that I do." "Opium," he said, his voice firm. "A faint but distinct trace clings to the fabric. A man of Sir Reginald's standing would not frequent such establishments. It was introduced to him deliberately." Lestrade frowned. "You're suggesting poisoning." Holmes's fingers traced the skin behind the ear, where a tiny, discoloured mark was visible. "A puncture wound. No bruising around the throat, no sign of struggle. This was no robbery." He stood, brushing the dust from his knees. "No, Lestrade, Sir Reginald was executed." The inspector exhaled sharply. "And the playing card?" Holmes took the jack of spades from a constable's outstretched hand. He turned it over, studying the inscription as though it were an old acquaintance. "Silentium mortis." "This is not a calling card, gentlemen," Holmes said at last. "It is a signature. The house of Sir Reginald Ashford bore all the markings of wealth, tall, imposing, and lined with heavy curtains that concealed more than just the sunlight. A uniformed officer admitted us, his boots leaving damp imprints upon the polished floor. Inside, the study was in considerable disarray. Drawers had been pulled out, their contents strewn across the floor in a fashion that suggested urgency rather than mere carelessness. A glass decanter lay shattered by the fireplace, the last remnants of its contents staining the rug. Holmes moved like a man reading an unseen script. "Notice, Watson, the precision of the disturbance," he murmured, gesturing towards the overturned papers. "A common thief would ransack indiscriminately. But here, the desk is the only point of focus. They were looking for something specific." My gaze followed his, landing upon a half-open drawer, its contents jumbled. I reached in, sifting through the papers. They were largely unremarkable. Ledgers, correspondences, legal documents. But at the very bottom, my fingers closed around something unusual. A black, leather-bound dossier, unmarked, save for an unfamiliar symbol embossed on the cover. Holmes took it from me, with great care. He turned the cover and flipped through the pages, his eyes narrowing. "The names," he murmured. "The names, Watson. Judges, financiers, politicians. Some still in office, some who resigned mysteriously in recent months." I swallowed. "You believe this is connected to the secret society Sir Reginald spoke of?" "I believe," he said, his voice quiet but certain, "that we have just uncovered a most dangerous thread in the fabric of London's unseen rulers." Holmes had been pacing the length of Sir Reginald Ashford's study for several minutes, his sharp gaze flitting from object to object, with the restless energy of a mind moving far ahead of ordinary comprehension. I stood beside the desk, still turning over the implications of the names we had uncovered, when Holmes abruptly halted before the bookshelf. "Watson," he murmured, "consider this. A man who fears for his life, who claims to possess damning evidence, and yet leaves his study unlocked and his papers strewn carelessly about. Does this not strike you as unnatural?" "Perhaps he did not expect them to strike so soon," I suggested. Holmes shook his head. "A man in such a position would take precautions, and if his knowledge truly threatened them, he would not keep his most valuable secrets where they could be so easily found." He ran his fingers along the spines of the books, pausing at an unremarkable volume on Roman history, its leather binding slightly more worn than the rest. Without hesitation, he plucked it from the shelf. The book did not come freely. It resisted, as though affixed to something beyond sight. With a faint click, a thin envelope dropped onto the carpet. "Ah," Holmes murmured. "Now we approach the heart of the matter." The envelope was plain, but for the mark of a black rose stamped upon the wax seal. With a flick of his blade, Holmes slit it open and extracted a folded sheet of paper covered in an intricate cipher of symbols and numbers. His eyes gleamed with interest as he settled into a chair, his fingers steepled before him. For several minutes, there was only the quiet rustling of paper and the occasional tap of his finger against his temple. Then, without warning, he let out a short, triumphant breath. "It is an address," he declared, holding up the decoded message. "Or rather, a location. The Raven's Nest." I started at the name. That den of vice in Whitehall? The one frequented by politicians and financiers? "The very same," he said, rising swiftly. "A notorious gentleman's club, known for its discretion and its clientele. And, if I am not mistaken, the place where Sir Reginald's fate was sealed." He tossed the letter onto the desk and reached for his coat. "Come, Watson, we have an appointment with London's shadows." The night had grown thick with fog by the time we stepped into the streets. It swirled in heavy tendrils, muffling the gaslights and lending the city an air of spectral unreality. Holmes walked with his usual swift confidence, his coat drawn tightly against the chill, while I kept close at his side, my nerves tingling with an unshakable sense of unease. "Holmes," I muttered under my breath, "are we not taking a considerable risk? If the society Sir Reginald feared so greatly is indeed as powerful as he claimed, would they not be watching for any who pry too deeply?" Holmes's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "My dear Watson, they have been watching from the moment Sir Reginald crossed our threshold." His words sent a fresh chill through me, and I instinctively cast a glance over my shoulder. At first, I saw nothing but the rolling mist and the occasional flicker of lamplight upon wet cobblestones. Yet, as we turned a corner near Pall Mall, I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being observed. Holmes's pace did not falter, but I noticed the slight shift in his posture, the way his head tilted as though listening for something beyond ordinary hearing. "There," he murmured, so softly I barely caught it. I followed his gaze. A shadow, a figure just barely discernible against the darkened shop fronts, moved in synchrony with us, keeping a measured distance but never straying too far. Holmes's voice remained calm. "Our observer is trained. He does not linger in direct sight, nor does he hasten his pace. He is patient, content to follow and report rather than confront." I felt my fingers tighten instinctively. "And what do you propose we do about it?" Holmes smiled. "Why, let him believe we are unaware, of course. And when the time is right—" He suddenly quickened his stride, pulling me forward just as we turned another corner. "We shall make our move." Without warning, he yanked me into the narrow alcove of a shuttered tobacconist's shop, pressing a firm hand to my shoulder. We waited. A breath. A second. Then, footsteps. The figure emerged from the fog, still following the path we had taken. He was tall, draped in a long coat and hat, his face obscured in the dim light. For the first time, I saw the glint of something beneath his coat, a weapon perhaps. He paused, clearly expecting to see us continue ahead, but we were no longer there. Holmes moved like a striking serpent. In an instant, he had closed the distance, seizing the man's wrist and twisting him sharply against the shop's wooden facade. "Good evening," he said pleasantly. "I presume you have business with us?" The man struggled, but Holmes had anticipated it, tightening his grip with practiced ease. "I would advise against further resistance," he murmured. "It would be most unwise." For a moment, there was silence. Then, with a sudden, wrenching motion, the man wrenched free, spun on his heel, and disappeared into the fog. Holmes did not pursue him. He merely stood there, watching the mist close over the retreating figure, his expression unreadable. "Curious," he murmured at last. I exhaled sharply. "Curious?" Holmes, the man was armed. He might have killed you. Holmes's gaze remained fixed on the empty street. Yes, he said softly. And yet, he did not even try. There was something deeply unsettling about his tone, something that suggested our pursuer had not fled out of fear, but out of design. Holmes straightened his coat. "Come, Watson," he said, resuming his stride. "Tonight, the Raven's Nest awaits." The Raven's Nest was a name that carried with it an air of exclusivity and whispered intrigue. Situated in the heart of Whitehall, it was known to be a gathering place for men of power, politicians, financiers, and those whose influence rarely made the pages of the newspapers, but shaped the very fabric of London's governance. Few knew what transpired behind its heavy oak doors, but it was said that decisions of great consequence were made over brandy and cigars in its dimly lit parlours. Holmes and I had donned attire befitting the club's usual patrons: fine evening coats, silk cravats, and the quiet confidence of men accustomed to privilege. It was a world I had brushed against in my time as a military doctor, but one that Holmes navigated with an unsettling ease, as if he had been born to it. At the entrance, a stout, expressionless doorman regarded us with the scrutiny of one accustomed to turning away the unworthy. Before he could question us, Holmes handed him a small embossed card, acquired no doubt through one of his many obscure channels. The man examined it, his brow furrowing slightly, before stepping aside. "Gentlemen, welcome to the Raven's Nest." We entered a world of low-burning lamps and murmured conversations. The air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and aged spirits, the atmosphere one of refined indulgence. Along the far wall, a group of men sat in a quiet discussion, their heads bent close together. Another pair stood by the fireplace, their words too faint to catch, yet their tone carried an unmistakable weight. Holmes's gaze flickered over the room, absorbing details that to me seemed insignificant: the placement of the attendants, the positioning of the seats, the subtle body language of those engaged in conversation. I knew better than to interrupt his study. A waiter approached, his demeanour deferential. "May I offer you a drink, sirs?" Holmes smiled, the gesture not quite reaching his eyes. "A brandy for my friend," he said, indicating me, "and for myself, information." The waiter did not flinch, nor did he acknowledge the unorthodox request. "I'm afraid we serve only the finest liquors here, sir." Holmes inclined his head. "Then I shall take a name instead, one that I suspect is known within these walls: the Order of the Black Rose." The reaction was imperceptible to most, but I saw it: the faintest tightening of the man's fingers around his tray, the slight stiffening of his posture before he recovered himself. He gave a short nod and vanished into the haze of the club. Holmes leaned back in his chair, a satisfied gleam in his eyes. "Watson," he murmured, "I do believe we have their attention." Holmes and I remained seated, adopting the easy manner of men idly passing an evening in leisure. Though beneath this facade, I could feel the tension coiling between us. Our exchange with the waiter had been brief, yet it had confirmed one crucial fact. The name of the order was known here. The way the man had stiffened, the flicker of recognition he had been unable to suppress, these were all the confirmation Holmes required. I had long since learned that in such situations, silence was often the most effective strategy. So I said nothing as Holmes swirled his untouched drink between his fingers, his gaze drifting absently across the room. Yet I knew better than to be deceived by this act of indifference. It was not long before we received our first thread of information. A pair of well-dressed gentlemen seated near the hearth had engaged in what seemed to be casual conversation, but as Holmes subtly shifted his position, his expression sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Listen closely, Watson," he murmured, barely moving his lips. I did so, straining my ears above the hum of the club. The two men spoke in low, measured tones, their words just audible through the haze of voices. Henderson refused, but he was given the warning. If he does not comply, he will find himself— A sip of brandy, a pause. Silenced, like the others. The order does not tolerate disloyalty. His companion let out a quiet breath. It is all moving swiftly. The Foreign Office matter is resolved, and the judge, well, we both know where his loyalties lie now. There was a short, humorless chuckle. It is remarkable how persuasive a man can be when his fortune, his family, and his very life are at stake. I turned to Holmes, expecting some indication of what he had gleaned from this exchange, but his face remained impassive, his fingers tapping lightly against the glass in his hand. The second man continued. And Sir Reginald. A pause. He overstepped. His example will serve well enough. A chill ran through me. It was not simply the matter-of-fact tone in which the words were spoken, but the terrifying simplicity of the statement. Sir Reginald had been a man of standing, yet his elimination had been treated as a mere inconvenience, an example to dissuade others. Holmes exhaled softly. Fascinating, he murmured. I could contain my unease no longer. Holmes, I whispered. This is no ordinary conspiracy. These men hold power in every corner of society. If what we have just overheard is true, their influence extends into Parliament, the judiciary, perhaps even Scotland Yard. Holmes set down his glass with careful deliberation. Yes, Watson, he said. It is quite the tangled web, is it not? I frowned. And yet you seem unperturbed. His lips quirked into the faintest of smiles. On the contrary, I find their confidence most enlightening. The Order of the Black Rose is accustomed to working unseen, to bending men to their will through fear and leverage. He lifted his gaze toward the men by the hearth, his grey eyes sharp with calculation. But they have made one fatal miscalculation, Watson. And what is that? They assume that no one is watching them. Holmes rose smoothly to his feet. Come, my dear fellow, the game is afoot. Holmes remained standing for only a moment before resuming his seat, his posture unchanged, his expression betraying nothing. Yet I, who knew him well, could sense the heightened intensity of his observation, the way his gaze flicked imperceptibly across the room. We are being watched, he murmured. My own instincts, though far less refined, had already detected the presence of a figure who had been observing us from the far side of the club, a thin, anxious-looking waiter, his apron folded and refolded in his hands, his eyes darting towards us before quickly turning away. He had passed our table twice, each time as though he meant to speak, only to lose his nerve at the last moment. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his fingers adjusting the placement of his glass upon the table. The movement was almost imperceptible, yet it carried a silent message. The waiter hesitated, his breathing shallow. Then, with great effort, he nodded towards a shadowed alcove near the back of the club. Holmes rose at once. Come, Watson, it would be rude to ignore such an invitation. I followed him, my pulse quickening. The alcove was poorly lit, its thick curtains muffling the sounds from the club beyond. The waiter stood there, wringing his hands, his face pale with fear. You know of the order, Holmes said calmly. It was not a question. The man swallowed hard, glancing around as though expecting danger to materialize from the very walls. You must leave, he whispered hoarsely. You do not understand. They see everything. Holmes regarded him with measured patience. Who are they? The waiter's lips parted, but before a sound could escape, there was a sudden, swift motion from the darkness, a flicker of steel, a gleam of cold precision. The man stiffened, his eyes wide with terror. His hands clutched at his chest, where the hilt of a thin-bladed dagger protruded just beneath his ribs. A strangled gasp escaped him, and he staggered forward. Holmes caught him before he could collapse. Blood, dark and warm, spilled across the man's apron. He gripped Holmes's arm, his mouth working soundlessly, before he forced out his final rattling words. They see everything. The Black Rose wilts in fire. His body convulsed once, then was still. I turned sharply, catching a glimpse of a shadowed figure slipping through the club, moving with calculated ease toward the exit. Holmes released the waiter's lifeless form and straightened, his grey eyes flashing. "They wished to silence him, Watson," he said, "which means he was telling the truth." Holmes knelt beside the body, his sharp gaze scanning every detail. He moved with methodical precision, his fingers searching the folds of the man's apron, the pockets of his coat. The murder had been swift, silent, and deliberate, an execution rather than an attack. At last, his hand closed upon something inside the dead man's waistcoat. A small, crumpled scrap of paper, half burnt at the edges. He smoothed it out, studying the faint markings that remained. "A message?" I asked. Holmes did not immediately reply. His eyes flickered across the writing, taking in the partially destroyed words. Then, with a quiet note of satisfaction, he held it up for me to see. "An address," he murmured. "Or rather, what remains of one." I examined it closely. Though much of the ink had been scorched away, a few letters were still legible, alongside a number. Limehouse, Dock Street. I exhaled sharply. Limehouse, a district known for its opium dens, clandestine dealings, and the sort of men who preferred shadows to sunlight. Holmes tucked the fragment into his pocket and rose to his feet. Around us, the club had returned to its usual murmur of conversation. If any of its patrons had noticed the murder, they gave no indication. "We have outstayed our welcome, Watson," Holmes said, "and our next destination is clear." He turned toward the exit, his movements brisk, decisive. I followed without hesitation, though my mind was still reeling. A secret society that saw everything. A man silenced before he could speak a single name. And now, the only clue we possessed, an address leading us deeper into the underworld of London. Holmes had said the Order of the Black Rose assumed no one was watching them. He had now ensured that they were mistaken. The hansom carried us swiftly through the damp streets of London, the gaslights flickering dimly against the ever-present mist. Holmes sat in silence, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his expression one of deep contemplation. As for myself, I could not shake the uneasy weight that had settled upon my chest since leaving the Raven's Nest. "Holmes," I began hesitantly, "I cannot help but feel that we have placed ourselves in a most perilous position." He did not stir. "We are dealing with men who kill without hesitation. Sir Reginald, the waiter, both silenced before they could reveal the truth. And yet you press forward, as if we are merely solving a puzzle in the comfort of Baker Street." Holmes turned his gaze upon me then, and there was no mistaking the fierce intelligence that burned behind his eyes. "My dear Watson," he said, "do you believe that fear is not also present within me? That I do not recognize the danger we face?" He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. "But consider, if these men are truly as omnipotent as you fear, then there is no corner of this city in which we would be safe. To retreat is as perilous as to advance." I exhaled, folding my arms. And yet, what do we truly know? A name whispered in the shadows, a secret society that holds influence in places we cannot reach. Even Scotland Yard may be compromised. Who, then, can be trusted? Holmes studied me for a moment before reaching into his pocket and retrieving the charred scrap of paper, the Limehouse address, the last clue given by the dying waiter. He held it between two fingers. "This," he said, "is our next step." I stared at him, half expecting some trace of hesitation, but there was none. "You are resolved, then?" I asked. Holmes's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "We tread upon treacherous ground, Watson, but the only way forward is through." The narrow streets of Limehouse bore little resemblance to the polished grandeur of Whitehall. Here, the city's pulse beat with a different rhythm, one of whispered transactions, of men who shunned daylight, of secrets buried deeper than the cobbled pathways that wound through its labyrinthine alleys. The Thames, ever watchful, lapped against the docks as though murmuring its own silent warnings to those who dared venture too close to the truth. Holmes and I proceeded cautiously. The address we had extracted from the dead waiter's possession had led us to a derelict warehouse on the river's edge, its windows dark, its door warped with age. Holmes observed it with a critical eye before stepping forward. He pressed a gloved hand against the door frame and nodded to himself. "The dust has been disturbed," he murmured. "We are not the first to pass this way tonight." He extracted a set of slender tools from his coat and, within moments, had coaxed the lock into submission. The door creaked open, revealing a space so thick with shadow that I instinctively reached for my revolver. "A wise precaution, Watson," Holmes remarked. "But I suspect our greatest threats will not come at the barrel of a pistol." We advanced into the gloom, our footsteps echoing softly against the wooden floorboards. At first, there seemed to be little within the warehouse beyond the remnants of long-abandoned crates. But Holmes, ever observant, directed my attention to a trapdoor partially concealed beneath a discarded tarpaulin. He knelt, brushing away the dust, and examined its edges. "A recent addition," he noted. "Someone has taken great care to conceal it." With a quick movement, he pried it open. A stone staircase spiraled downward into blackness, the air thick with damp and something else. Something metallic, something faintly acrid. We descended. At the base of the staircase, we found ourselves in a chamber unlike any I had ever seen. Its walls bore ornate carvings, symbols that I could not decipher, but which Holmes studied with grim intent. At the centre stood a massive table covered in ledgers, letters, and documents bearing official seals. But what drew my breath short was the map pinned against the far wall. London, marked with a series of red circles. Holmes strode forward, examining the markings with keen interest. "Watson," he said quietly, "this is no ordinary gathering place. This is an operational centre, one that has dictated the fate of London for years." My eyes scanned the documents before me, the names, the signatures. Judges, politicians, financiers, all bound by the silent grip of the Order of the Black Rose. "The scale of it," I murmured. "It is monstrous." Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. "It is power, Watson," he said, "and it is time that power was undone." Holmes stood before the great wooden table in the hidden chamber beneath Limehouse, his fingers lightly tracing the edges of the ledgers spread before him. He had been silent for several minutes, his mind weaving together the threads of the conspiracy with an intensity that was almost tangible. I had come to recognize these moments, not of hesitation, but of calculation. At last he turned to me. "Watson, we cannot dismantle this society in the shadows. They thrive upon secrecy, upon the belief that no one may touch them. We must force them into the open." I frowned. "But how?" "We do not yet know the full extent of their reach. Even now, there may be men within Scotland Yard who would act against us the moment we attempt to strike." Holmes nodded. "Precisely why we must turn their own methods against them. These ledgers reveal much. Names, transactions, debts owed and collected. But this," he tapped his fingers upon a particular document, "this is what shall serve us best." I leaned in, scanning the parchment. It was a record of blackmail payments made to an unnamed recipient, regular, substantial sums, the most recent of which was marked for collection that very night. "A delivery," I murmured. "But to whom?" Holmes smiled thinly. "That, my dear fellow, is precisely what we shall allow them to believe they are about to discover." It was a bold deception. Holmes swiftly composed a false communication, one that suggested a vital piece of evidence capable of exposing the order in its entirety, was to be moved under armed guard from Limehouse to a secured location in the city. The message was then sent through one of Holmes's own channels, ensuring that it would reach the ears of those who had the most to lose. "Their response shall be predictable," Holmes remarked as he set down his pen. "If they are as entrenched as we suspect, they will not risk allowing such a document to reach its destination. They will attempt to seize it before it can be delivered." "And if they do not?" I asked. Holmes gave a short, knowing chuckle. "Then, Watson, I shall have greatly overestimated their intelligence." The trap was set. Now all that remained was to see who would walk into it. The streets of London were cloaked in an oppressive fog, the gas lights casting dim halos upon the damp cobblestones. Midnight had come, and with it the culmination of our carefully laid scheme. The decoy carriage, bearing what the Order of the Black Rose believed to be damning evidence against them, rolled steadily through the quiet streets, its wheels rattling softly against the road. Holmes and I followed at a distance, our figures obscured in the shadows. Inspector Lestrade and a contingent of Scotland Yard's finest had taken up concealed positions along the route. Holmes had predicted the exact moment the order would strike, and now we had only to wait. I felt a tightening in my chest. The enemy we faced was not a singular villain, but an entrenched network of power, men who had orchestrated the deaths of those who opposed them without hesitation or remorse. They would not retreat without a fight. Holmes, ever composed, seemed to sense my thoughts. "Steel yourself, Watson," he murmured. "The trap is set, and the prey approaches." No sooner had he spoken than a figure detached itself from the shadows, then another, then three more. Masked men, their movements swift and practiced, emerged from alleyways, their boots barely making a sound against the pavement. With an efficiency that bespoke careful planning, they halted the carriage, one stepping forward to seize the reins while the others moved to surround it on all sides. Then, in a single breath, the night erupted into chaos. "Now, Lestrade!" Holmes called. From the darkness, Scotland Yard officers surged forth, their batons raised, their voices ringing out in commands. The would-be hijackers barely had time to react before they were beset on all sides. The crack of fists meeting flesh, the scuffle of boots against stone, the air was alive with the sound of combat. I caught a glimpse of Holmes, his movements swift and precise, disarming one of the assailants with an ease that spoke to his years of study in the art of self-defense. Lestrade, for all his bluster in quieter moments, fought with a dogged determination, knocking one of the masked men to the ground before wrenching away his weapon. One by one, the conspirators fell, their struggles rendered futile against the sheer force of the ambush. At last, the night fell still. Lestrade wiped his brow and exhaled. "By heaven, Holmes, you were right. They came for it like moths to a flame." Holmes crouched beside one of the subdued men, peeling away the mask. Beneath it, the face of a well-respected judge stared back at us, his expression twisted with rage. Another lay beside him, a man I recognized from the halls of Parliament. "Good Lord," I muttered. "Holmes, the order was closer to the heart of London than we imagined." Holmes rose to his feet, his gaze unreadable. "Indeed, Watson," he murmured, "but the true architect of this web has yet to show his face." And then, as though summoned by his very words, a slow, deliberate clap echoed from the far end of the street. Holmes turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. From the mist, a solitary figure emerged, a man clad in a long, dark coat, his face obscured by the shadows of his wide-brimmed hat. A single black rose was pinned to his lapel, and though I could not see his eyes, I felt them upon us, filled with something cold, something calculating. Holmes, for the first time that night, was still. The mastermind had arrived. A hush fell over the street as every eye turned toward the solitary figure standing at the far end of the alley. The masked men lay subdued, Scotland Yard officers securing their bindings. Yet I sensed that the true danger had only just revealed itself. The man who had emerged from the fog was unlike the desperate criminals we had apprehended. There was no fear in his stance, no hesitation in his movements. He was clad in a long, flowing greatcoat, his face obscured beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. But it was not these details that struck me. It was the pin upon his lapel, a small but unmistakable symbol. A black rose, wrought in silver. Holmes's fingers tightened at his sides. "Watson," he murmured, "take note." We are in the presence of something far more dangerous than mere conspirators. The figure did not move for several moments, as though surveying the scene with quiet amusement. Then, with slow deliberation, he lifted his gloved hands and began to applaud. A slow, measured sound that echoed unnaturally in the narrow passageway. "Bravo, Mr. Holmes," came the voice, rich, smooth, and touched with the faintest trace of amusement. "You have done what few before you have dared. You have pulled back the curtain and glimpsed the machinery of the world." Lestrade, who had until now been watching in confusion, took a sharp step forward. "You there! Hands where I can see them." Holmes, however, lifted a hand to still him. His gaze remained fixed upon the stranger. "You presume much, sir," he said quietly. "You speak as though this game has ended. I am inclined to believe otherwise." The man chuckled softly. "And therein lies your brilliance, Mr. Holmes. You see deeper than most, yet not quite deep enough. You have captured pawns, nothing more. The board remains as it was. The king is untouched, the game unchanged." Holmes tilted his head ever so slightly. "You assume that I do not yet know the name of the hand that moves the pieces. A dangerous assumption." The stranger's lips curved into the ghost of a smile. "Do you?" For a fleeting moment, Holmes was silent. His eyes locked onto the figure before him, and I knew his mind was working at lightning speed, analyzing every inflection, every breath, every detail. And then Holmes smiled. "I do," he said simply. For the first time, the man stiffened. It was a barely perceptible shift, but to Holmes it was as revealing as a signed confession. Lestrade, seizing the moment, barked, "That's enough! Step forward now, sir, or we shall take you by force." The stranger exhaled softly. "Alas, Inspector, your reach does not extend as far as you might wish." And then he moved. With a single fluid motion, he reached to his side and cast something to the ground. A thick plume of dark smoke erupted, curling through the air with unnatural speed. I barely had time to react before my vision was consumed by the dense fog. "Holmes!" I shouted, feeling for my revolver. But Holmes did not respond. He was already moving, cutting through the smog with terrifying precision. I caught the faintest glimpse of his silhouette darting forward, but by the time I reached his side, the rooftop above us was empty. The man had vanished. The smoke began to clear, revealing the stunned faces of the officers, the bound and captured members of the order, and Holmes, standing utterly still, his gaze fixed on the spot where the figure had disappeared. Lestrade cursed under his breath. "Blasted trickery! I'll have the men search every corner of this district." Holmes did not move. "That will be quite unnecessary," he murmured. I stepped closer. "Holmes." For several seconds he said nothing. Then slowly he lifted his hand. I followed his gaze, and there, resting between his fingers, was a small scrap of parchment. The man had left it behind. Holmes unfolded it carefully, his expression unreadable. I peered over his shoulder. It contained only 3 words, written in a bold, elegant hand. "Not yet, Sherlock." A silence fell between us. Holmes exhaled through his nose and tucked the note into his coat. Then he turned on his heel and strode toward the awaiting officers. "See that these men are taken in, Lestrade, and I trust you will take great care with their testimonies," he said briskly. "The order will attempt to erase them from existence before dawn." Lestrade, who was still reeling from the escape of the stranger, gave a short nod. "Aye, you've got my word on that." Holmes glanced back at me. "Come, Watson. We have much to discuss." As we made our way from the alley, I could not shake the deep unease that had settled within me. For all our triumph in capturing the conspirators, for all the progress we had made in exposing the order, the man who orchestrated it all had slipped through our grasp. I turned to Holmes. "You knew who he was, didn't you?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He merely adjusted his coat, his eyes dark with thought. "Not yet, Watson," he murmured, "but soon." And with that, we stepped into the night, the shadows of London still thick with secrets. The cells at Scotland Yard were not unfamiliar to me, yet I had seldom stood within them with such an oppressive weight upon my mind. The events of the past hours had been a triumph on paper, yet neither Holmes nor I were deceived into thinking the Order of the Black Rose had truly been vanquished. Before us, bound to a chair with his hands manacled before him, sat one of the highest-ranking members we had captured, Lord Alfred Dunwich, a man of considerable influence in the financial circles of London. Hours ago, he had been a respected peer of the realm. Now, he was a prisoner, his finely tailored waistcoat torn, his cravat loosened, yet his confidence utterly unshaken. Lestrade folded his arms. "You may as well speak plainly, Dunwich. The game is up. We've enough evidence in these ledgers to bring your entire society before the courts." Dunwich chuckled. "And yet, Inspector, you have no idea what game you are playing." His voice was smooth, his manner unbothered. Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Your agents lie bound within these very walls. Your secret records now rest in the hands of Scotland Yard. I should think your bravado is somewhat misplaced." Dunwich met Holmes's gaze with an unsettling calm. "Is it? I rather think not. You see, Mr. Holmes, the Order is not a collection of individuals. It is an institution. You have removed a handful of men, but the Black Rose flourishes in the dark. Its roots stretch far beyond what you can imagine." Lestrade scoffed. "You'll change your tune when you're standing before the judge." Dunwich's smile did not waver. "Which judge, Inspector? The one who sits on our payroll, or perhaps the Minister of Justice, whose career we financed?" A chill settled over the room. Holmes's voice was quiet. "And who sits at the very centre of this web?" Dunwich's expression did not change, yet something flickered behind his eyes. He leaned back, tilting his head slightly. Then, in a voice filled with quiet certainty, he murmured, "The Black Rose never dies." Back at Baker Street, Holmes sat in his chair, the glow of the fire casting long shadows across his features. He had not spoken for some time. His hands pressed together beneath his chin as he reviewed the scattered pieces of evidence upon the table. I watched him with growing unease. Dunwich's words were no mere bravado, were they? Holmes exhaled softly. "No, Watson, they were not." He gestured toward the ledgers, the coded messages, the scraps of correspondence we had recovered. "These documents tell us much, but not enough. The Order of the Black Rose is not a new invention. It is an institution, one that has shaped the course of history for centuries, moulding the powerful, eliminating the disobedient." He tapped one of the older documents. "This letter dates back nearly 100 years, yet its language is identical to those written mere weeks ago. Different men, Watson, but the same hand guiding them all." I shuddered. "Then all we have done is prune the rose, not uproot it," he finished. I leaned back, rubbing my temples. Surely, with men like Dunwich in custody, we can dismantle it piece by piece. Holmes gave me a long, unreadable look before rising from his chair. He moved to the window, staring out into the London night. "Perhaps," he said at last, "or perhaps the roots have grown so deep that even if we cut one stem, another will bloom in its place." I studied him in silence. Holmes had solved many mysteries in our time together, yet I sensed that this one weighed upon him in a way I had never seen before. Finally, he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "This is not over, Watson. Not yet." And as the firelight flickered across his sharp, knowing eyes, I could not shake the feeling that the shadows of the Black Rose still stretched over London. The hour was late when Holmes and I departed Scotland Yard, leaving behind the cold, unfeeling cells that now housed the captured members of the Order. The air was thick with fog, rolling in waves over the gaslit streets, muffling the distant sounds of carriage wheels, and the occasional cry of a hawker packing up his wares for the night. We walked in silence for some time, each lost in our own thoughts. I could not shake the sense of unease that had settled over me, the weight of all that remained unanswered. Finally, I spoke. "Holmes," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Have we truly stopped them?" Holmes did not answer at once. He walked with his hands clasped behind his back, his head tilted slightly downward in thought. Then, in his usual measured tone, he replied, "We have merely pruned the rose, Watson, but its roots run deep." A shiver ran through me. "Then you believe they will rise again?" Holmes exhaled softly, his breath curling into the mist. "I believe, Watson, that the forces we contend with do not perish so easily. The men we have captured will be replaced, their silence purchased, or their disappearances orchestrated. The true architects of this society will not have been so careless as to leave themselves vulnerable. Even as we speak, they are already shifting, adjusting, ensuring their survival." I let his words settle. "Then what have we accomplished?" Holmes stopped walking and turned to me, his sharp gaze cutting through the gloom. "We have sent them a message that they are not untouchable, that their secrets, however well hidden, can be unearthed. And that, my dear Watson, is the first crack in the foundation." He resumed his pace, and I followed, though my mind remained troubled. For all his brilliance, for all the triumph of the night, I could not shake the feeling that we had merely disturbed something far greater than we could yet comprehend, and that it was watching us still. As we walked, I found myself reflecting on the events that had unfolded, the stark realization that the world we inhabited was far darker and more intricate than I had ever imagined. I had once believed that justice was a force as immutable as the rising of the sun, that those who conspired in secrecy could always be brought into the light. But now I was no longer certain. There were forces that moved unseen through society, men who did not act with brute force, but with influence, men who did not steal but acquired, men who did not murder with their own hands but simply gave the order. The law, for all its might, seemed ill-equipped to grasp such intangible threats. Holmes strode beside me, his expression unreadable. He had always understood these truths better than I, had always seen the patterns in the chaos where others saw nothing. And yet, for the first time, I wondered if even he had glimpsed only a fraction of the whole. "Holmes," I said at last, "do you ever wonder if we fight against something too vast to ever truly defeat?" He did not stop walking, did not turn to me, but after a moment, he spoke. "We fight, Watson, because it is the only course left to us." And with that, we vanished into the London mist, our footsteps swallowed by the night. The black rose had been cut, but somewhere, in the depths of the city, its roots still grew. The fog had thickened as Holmes and I approached Baker Street, curling around the gaslights like a living thing. The city was quiet, yet I could not shake the sensation that we were still being watched, that some unseen hand still lingered in the shadows, observing, waiting. Holmes, as always, seemed unfazed. He strode ahead, deep in thought, his hands clasped behind his back. When we reached the familiar doorstep of 221B, he paused and turned to me. "You are troubled, Watson," I exhaled, shaking my head. "It is this feeling, Holmes, that for all we have done, the true puppet masters remain hidden, that we have not truly won." Holmes regarded me for a moment, then gave a small, knowing smile. "Tell me, Watson, have you ever seen a gardener tend to roses?" I frowned at the abrupt shift. "I suppose I have. They prune the dead stems, remove the blighted leaves, cut away what is seen. Yet, beneath the soil, the roots remain. The flower returns in time, stronger than before." He turned his gaze to the city beyond. "The order of the black rose is no different. It has weathered storms before, and it will again. But now, he tapped his temple lightly. They know they are seen. And the first step in toppling any great power, my dear fellow, is to remind it that it is not untouchable. I was silent for a moment, mulling over his words. At last I said, "And what if the roots grow back stronger than ever?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Then, Watson, we shall be there to cut them once more." Holmes believes the most dangerous criminals are those who remain unseen, shaping the world from the shadows. But every web has a weak point, a single mistake that can bring it all crumbling down. What do you think was the Order's greatest misstep? Was it their arrogance, their secrecy, or something else entirely? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you wish to uncover more mysteries with Holmes and me, be sure to subscribe and share this tale with fellow lovers of detective fiction. After all, the greatest mysteries are those still waiting to be solved.